Middle-earth has seen hundreds of battles, some big, some small, some that spanned and then decided the fate of entire regions of the continent, but some places, thanks to their strategic locations or sometimes even due to bad luck, saw far more battles than others, to the point of where they developed reputations as battlegrounds and little else. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the deadliest battlegrounds throughout the history of Middle-earth. If you're familiar with Middle-earth, and specifically with the Silmarillion, then you probably already know Middle-earth's most deadly battleground, or at least, it was Middle-earth's most deadly battleground. Of course, I'm talking about Anfauglith, the Gasping Dust, the massive plain that lay between Angband and the rest of Beleriand. Flanked on all four sides by hills and mountains, Anfauglith was a natural battleground. If the forces of Morgoth wanted to assail Beleriand, they had to cross Anfauglith, and vice versa. In the beginning, Anfauglith was actually known as Ardgallen. It was a fairly pleasant grassy plain, even though it lay before the gates of Angband itself. But even during these years, it was the site of several battles. Morgoth's forces were pursued and hunted across the plain during the Dagorlad, and later, Morgoth's forces were again crushed at the southern edge of the plain during the Dagorlad, the Glorious Battle. And then, it became the site of the Siege of Angband. Soldiers camped beneath the walls of Angband, and companies of horsemen patrolled the plain. And then it all went horribly wrong. During the Dagorlad, Morgoth unleashed rivers of fire that scorched the plain, killing many of those who could not evacuate quickly enough. Morgoth's armies then surged forward, battering against the Eredwetherin, Dorthonion, and the March of Maedhros. That said, most of the fighting did not take place upon Anfauglith itself, but the following battle, the Neneath Anoediad, was fought entirely amidst the Gasping Dust. In that battle, the Union of Maedhros was crushed, and that war turned decisively in Morgoth's favour. There was one final battle fought on Anfauglith, the final battle of the decades-long War of Wrath. It was when the host of the Valar was on Anfauglith when Morgoth unleashed his final weapon, the Winged Dragons, and for a time they successfully drove back the forces of Valinor. But it was not enough for Morgoth. He was defeated, and rather mercifully, in the aftermath of the War of Wrath, Beleriand sank beneath the waves, and all of Anfauglith along with it. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that over the course of the near 600-year-long war against Morgoth, that hundreds of thousands on both sides had been killed upon the plain. Hence, if there was one place that needed to be sunk, with the exception of Nandungatheb, that horrible spider valley, then it needed to be Anfauglith. Anfauglith, rather unfortunately, had a direct successor. This was a place where the battles were not as frequent or as deadly, but this place still far exceeded anywhere else in Middle-earth at that time. I'm talking about Dagorlad, the battle plain. Like Anfauglith, Dagorlad was a dusty plain that sustained little to no life, and it also occupied a strategic location. It lay before the Morannon, the Black Gate, that guarded the entrance to Mordor. It also lay before the lands of Northern Ithilien. Thus, for many years, it served as Gondor's de facto northern border, and was the site of several invasions. The most famous battle that took place on Dagorlad was the first, simply called the Battle of Dagorlad. It was the titanic clash during the War of the Last Alliance. The forces of Gondor, Arnor, Lindon, Khazad-dûm, Lorien, and Greenwood facing off against all of Sauron's servants, men, orcs, beasts, and even a few dwarves. Although Sauron's forces were defeated, and he was forced to retreat into Mordor, it was a costly battle for the Last Alliance, especially for the Sylvan Elves of Greenwood and Lorien. Foolishly, King Orifer of Greenwood had charged first without orders, and his troops were mauled. Following that, the Sylvan Elves of Lorien were driven into the marshes to the south and west. Many were killed and buried there, and eventually, this haunted place would become known as the Dead Marshes. That was not the only battle to be fought on Dagorlad. When the Easterlings were invading Gondor, they often had to cross the plain, and two battles were fought here against the Wainriders, one in 1899 and another in 1944. The first battle isn't actually named, but the forces of Gondor, led by King Kalimatar, were eventually victorious following the timely arrival of Gondorian and Aethiod cavalry from the north. The Wainriders fled, leaving a third of their force dead upon the plain. The second battle, the Disaster of the Morannon, was a, disaster for Gondor. The Wainriders ambushed the Gondorian army as it was taking position upon the plain. King Onderher and his two sons were killed, and the Gondorian army's centre was completely obliterated. The final battle to take place, technically upon Dagorlad, was the Battle of the Black Gate, one of the final battles of the War of the Ring. 6,000 men of Gondor and Rohan fought against Sauron's forces that outnumbered them over 10 times. It was a suicide attack, a distraction, but fortunately it worked. The One Ring was destroyed, and Sauron's demoralized forces fled or were once again slain upon the plain. So, like Anfauglith, it's probable that at least over 100,000 lost their lives upon Dagorlad. But, unlike Anfauglith, Dagorlad was at least the site of more victories than defeats. The next battleground is, well, sad, because it's not a giant, dusty plain, it's a city, or at least it was a city. I'm talking about Osgiliath. Once the glorious capital of Gondor, by the end of the Third Age, Osgiliath was a battleground between the forces of Gondor and Mordor. For Mordor, capturing Osgiliath was a must for invading Gondor, as it was one of only 2 reliable ways across the River Anduin. For Gondor, the city was a choke point, and the ruins nullified the number advantage that the forces of Sauron usually had. Osgiliath saw its first taste of battle at the beginning of the War of the Last Alliance. After overrunning Minas Ithil, Sauron's forces did make it to Osgiliath, but they didn't break into the city, and Anarion managed to drive them back to the mountains. Sadly enough, the first battle to actually take place in Osgiliath was not between the forces of Gondor and Mordor. No, it was a Gondorian civil war. His kingdom turning against him, King Eldacar tried to hold out in Osgiliath, where he was besieged by the forces of Castamir the Usurper. Eldacar was eventually forced to flee, and Castamir, showing his cruel streak, needlessly sacked the city. The sack of Osgiliath during the Kin Strife heralded the decline of the city. Its population suffered greatly during the Great Plague, and Minas Anor, Minas Tirith that is, became Gondor's new capital. Then, when Minas Ithil fell to the Nazgul in 2002, more people fled Osgiliath as it was now the new front line in the war against Mordor. But the city did not become an actual battleground until 2475, shortly after the end of the Watchful Peace. In a surprise attack, Uruks from Mordor overran Ithilien and Osgiliath, the last inhabitants fled, and Osgiliath's great stone bridge was finally broken. From that point on, the city became a battleground between the forces of Gondor and Mordor. In the 500 years that followed, the city changed hands numerous times, Gondor usually holding the western bank, and sometimes the eastern bank as well. This was the case during the reign of Steward Denethor, but in 3018, the War of the Ring began with an attack on Osgiliath, and Sauron seized the eastern side of the city once again. The following year, when Sauron launched what was meant to be his final assault on Gondor, Osgiliath was attacked again, and Faramir fought a rearguard action in the city. After a day of fighting, the western side was also captured by the Morgul host. Fortunately, as Sauron's defeat came merely 2 weeks later, this was probably the final battle that was fought in Osgiliath, for well, hopefully ever. There's one final major battleground I want to talk about, and that was in the north of Middle-earth. Frodo was lucky enough to visit the chief fortress that was located there, and then was unlucky enough to get stabbed by the Witch King there. So yes, I'm talking about Weathertop or Amon Sul, and that battleground, the Weather Hills. Located fairly centrally in Eriador, the Weather Hills aren't an obvious strategic location, but they became a strategic location thanks to the geopolitical situation in Arnor during the Third Age. And I'm not even talking about Angmar yet. When Arnor split into Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur, the Weather Hills, and specifically Weathertop, lay almost perfectly at the border of the 3 successor kingdoms. Arthedain controlled Weathertop, and the Palantir that was located there, and Cardolan and Rhudaur wanted this for themselves, so the Weather Hills was the hotspot for the Arnorian civil war that raged on and off, at different intensities, over a period of about 500 years. But after that, Angmar arose and then allied itself with Rhudaur. The first major battle of the war took place in 1356, when the forces of Rhudaur, supported by Angmar, assaulted the Weather Hills, and although they were driven back, they succeeded in killing King Argaleb of Arthedain. In 1409, Angmar, now having effectively annexed Rhudaur, attacked again. This time, the Weather Hills were overrun, and Weathertop was destroyed, although the Palantir was saved. Following the War of 1409, it's unclear if Arthedain and the remnants of Cardolan attempted to reman the Weather Hills. There's no mention of further battles being fought there specifically, but given the location as a bulwark against Angmar and Rhudaur, it would have made sense. So perhaps with battles that weren't as big or as deadly as Dagorlad, or with the frequency of those that occurred in Osgiliath, the Weather Hills still saw a fair share of fighting. There's some honourable mentions, places that saw more than one major battle, and I'll go through them briefly. One was the Fords of Isen, which sort of guarded the border between Rohan and Dunland, and later Isengard. 2 battles were fought here during the War of the Ring. Another important crossing was the crossing of the Poros, that separated South Ithilien and Harondor. At least 2 major battles were fought here between the forces of Harad and Gondor during the Third Age. The dwarves also weren't strangers to battlefields. One, funnily enough, was Erebor and Dale, which were ruined by Smaug, and then, in the space of 80 years, were the location of 2 major battles, the Battle of the Five Armies, and later the Battle of Dale during the War of the Ring. Another dwarven battlefield was Azanul Bazaar, the valley beneath Moria. The final battle of the same name was fought here during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and another 2 battles were fought here by Balin's company, one when they were taking Moria, and one when they were being destroyed. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I think some of these places, especially Anfauglith and Dagorlad, would have been quite morbid. Soldiers lining up to fight in one battle might look down and see the remains of soldiers from battles that had previously fought there. It might have made them think that in a future battle, a future soldier might be looking down upon their own remains. Yay! I wonder where Tolkien got these ideas from. Perhaps it was his experience at the Somme. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the deadliest battleground of them all is the internet.